Class, Mr. G here. Today we're going over analog photography versus digital photography. We're going over some of the nuances between what you need to know about a camera, how a camera works, basically the mechanics of the camera. Hey class, Mr. G here. Today we're going to be going over the mechanics of the camera, how these things work. The three things that you guys were going over is sensor size, the light meter, and focal points or focal length. The standards that we're going over today's class are, we're dealing with creating, number 3, which is engaging an array of processes, media, techniques, and technology through experimentation, practice, and persistence. So today's video, we're talking about the mechanics of the camera, how this thing works, really the nuts and bolts of what everybody needs to know when they're starting to work on photography. First one there is sensor size. Now the sensor size in most DSLR cameras that we're going to get, now we're talking middle of the road range price, we're not talking the super multi-$1,000 pieces of equipment. Those ones are full frame sensors. Most everything else is an APS-C sensor unless you have a micro 4/3, but either way, those are crop sensors. Basically, you only have two types of sensors that you're going to work with. You're either going to work with a full frame sensor or you're going to work with a crop sensor. Yes, there is a large format sensor and there's other ones that fit in that spectrum, but for the most part, what most people are going to come across are those two, crop and full frame. Now, full frame basically harkens to the olden days when we had back to old school 35mm cameras. Now, the 35mm setup, that's the basis for the sensor layout of modern day cameras. Now, the big thing to remember between a full frame camera and a APS-C or a crop sensor camera is as you're using it, the lens length is what changes. This is no longer the number that it says on the body, a different calibration now. All right, so let's break that down. What does that mean? For old school analog 35mm cameras, every lens that you purchase was a traditional lens. It was a lens that was the correct focal length that it said on the body. The reason we get a 50mm is because this is the generic basic lens that came or that you got with an old school manual camera. Most of them either did not come with a zoom lens. Most kit lenses that you get are the 18 to 55 or 18 to 135, which is what I've got. And the reason being is because that's the focal length that most people are going to use on a day-to-day basis. If you spent more money and you got like a Canon 5D, the kit lens for that one is a 24 to 70, which basically works like the 18 to 55. Because of the crop sensor, you're going to have a more zoomed in effect of that lens. Let's start off with the 50mm lens. The 50mm lens is the same relation to your eye. This has the same viewpoint as the human eye. So that's the number one way to think about this, and use this as your base of reference for the majority of time that you're thinking about lenses, or either purchasing a lens, using a lens. Think about the 50mm is right where your eye goes. However, that does change when we're dealing with an APS-C sensor. Anytime that you're dealing with anything but a full frame sensor, you're going to have a crop factor that you're going to have to factor in. Now, crop factor works like this. APS-C lenses are 1.6 times more zoomed in than the traditional full frame sensor. So a 50mm lens now becomes an 80mm lens. So it's very simple math. 50 times 1.8 equals 80mm. Same thing with a 35mm. 35mm times 1.6 now becomes a 56mm lens. So if you have an APS-C sensor camera and you want to get something that is definitively the 50mm lens on a full frame camera, you want to go with a 35mm lens. Math today, that's what we're going to be doing. For focal length, there's two types of lenses. You have a prime lens and then you have zoom lenses. Now, both of these have their pros and cons of each. Pros of a prime lens. Prime lens has one fixed aperture and you're going to get that for the complete duration of however you're shooting. You can get fixed apertures with zoom lenses, however it's going to cost a lot more. This one set focal length. Now you can get different focal points, but your focal length is always going to be the same. You can't really zoom in with it. It's just kind of, it is what it is. Zoom lens, you can get different variances on getting a more cropped version of the image that you're trying to shoot, which is always good. But these do have more variable f-stops, which is the aperture change. Most apertures are going to flux between, they're going to have 3 or 4 different aperture changes. Let me give an example. So the smallest aperture that this has is 3.5, and that's when it's completely zoomed out all the way to the full 18, and then when you zoom in to the 135, it's going to change from that 3.5 is my lowest. Now it's a 5.6, and it doesn't sound like a big change, but it is a big change when you're dealing with certain lighting situations. So going with that in mind ahead of time just makes your life a little easier. I like to have both in my kit. I like to have zoom lenses and prime lenses. There's a lot of benefits of having a prime lens. There's a lot of benefits to having a zoom lens. It really just depends on your style, how you shoot, what you shoot, and all that kind of stuff. So that does vary. Your mileage will vary by that. However, I do recommend that you have at least one of each in your kit, just because the little bit of variety that gives you can push your creative boundaries a lot more. Going a little more in depth on the sensor size, the main issues with sensor size and the variances that you'll run into. Full frame sensors, you have the most light accepted from the lens to the sensor to the memory chip. You have the most amount of information from that shot that you're trying to take. So one of the big things that changes between sensor size and lenses is some lenses are especially made to work with certain sensor sizes. The reason being is because that aperture has changed just a little bit to make sure that fits on an APS-C sensor a little better. It's going to give a little more refined light than a traditional full frame lens. The big difference between full frame sensor and a crop sensor is exactly that. You're taking an image, and instead of having the full expanse of the image, now you're having a zoomed in cropped version of that image, which is going to limit some of the creative stuff that you want to do. So if you wanted to have that nice grandiose landscape, it's going to be a little more refined because of the crop sensor. Does that fully affect everything that you shoot? Not necessarily, because there's lenses out there that you can use that will give you that still full frame look, but you're only paying a crop sensor price. Now, the big issue that comes up with that, and I'm going to have probably somebody down in the comments is going to say, well, it's this way. When you go to print out some of these images, and let's be honest, majority of us use digital for digital variants of social media, for email, to put stuff on a website. Most of the time that's not going to become an issue. However, if you do print a lot of your images, a full frame sensor is going to be your best friend for that. Reason being is because that gives more information for when you go to print. It's going to print everything out. Pixel density is going to be a lot cleaner. It's just going to look a lot better when you print stuff. However, APS-C sensors, if for most of us, we deal with digital stuff. I deal with digital more times than not over print stuff. So I know that APS-C and the crop sensor stuff is going to be fine for me. I'm not going to need that full frame sensor. But if you are printing out a lot of stuff, full frame is the way to go. Now, if you know that this is a crop sensor, your phone is a way more crop sensor. You're getting a lot less information going to this sensor than you are to the larger sensor with the DSLR. Does that change the overall photography? Again, it comes back to one simple thing. Are you going to be printing these images, or are you just going to be using a digital version of these images? I take a lot of pictures on my phone. I prefer to take pictures with a camera. It's me, that's how I work, that's my mentality, that's what I do. However, if this is what you guys are working with, you're still doing some of the basic things that we're covering in this video. So understanding how this works and how this works also works in your favor. All right, so let's talk about focal point and focal length real quick. We're gonna take our camera, set up in front of our little mock friends. This camera right now I have on 17 millimeter on the top of my lens here. So the millimeter at the top here indicates what focal length it's already at, or so that if you use that for your guide, how much of a zoom effect are you going to get? So 17 to 24 to 35 to 50. I have these preset so that I can use it kind of like a faux zoom lens. That's when I change mine up. But you can see that when it's on 17, 24, 35, and 50, how much zoom you're going to be getting out of each of those sections. Now, what I like to do is I like to consider putting it on a certain zoom. Most of the time I'll set it on the 35, so I'll get my true to life look. But once I've set it on there, then I will move the camera to create the composition that I want to see. I won't just keep it dead on into that one frame. Now, when you're dealing with that focal length, again, you can maneuver that lens to create the shot that you're trying to make. Now, other things that you can remember is you have autofocus, manual focus. This is to help with image stabilization, to make sure that your image comes out as clean and perfect as it possibly can. However, when you have it on manual, you can then change the shutters, the focus. So if I want to rack focus, which is where I'm taking the focus off of one object and I'm shifting it to the other object and then back and forth. If you're having trouble getting it to focus on the object that you want to focus on instead of the object that you don't want to focus on, sometimes putting in a manual makes it a little easier to do that. Finally, one of the last features I wanted to talk about is switching it over to manual focus. Having it on the manual focus is going to help me a lot more with my light meter. Definitely one of those big things that I stress to my students is making sure that your light meter is the thing that you focus on while you're working on your shots mainly, so you can make sure that you have a shot that is properly exposed as well as proper. It just helps with your creative abilities, and that way you can make sure that when you're working in your photo editing software that your shot is going to come out just right. Also, remember to trust the light meter. You can trust, your eye, your vision, what you see is what you see. However, sometimes the light meter gives you a little more specialized view. Also, the screen that you guys are viewing your photos on is a more reduced screen, so sometimes that's going to be a lot more tricky while you guys are working as well. All right, class, I hope some of that demystified some of the stuff for you, the focal point, the sensor size, and the light meter. As always, let's go ahead and wrap up class today. Don't forget to let's take care of the homework, which is like, subscribe, share on all the various platforms. As always, if you guys have a question, comment, or concern, don't forget to raise your hand down in the comments below. Happy to answer those questions, get back to my students. As always, I will see you guys next class. Until then, later, guys. Math today, that's what we're going to be doing.